Welcome everyone to the next in our celebration of 20 years of BMSG. We decided to treat ourselves and have brown bags inviting some of our favorite thinkers to talk to us about whatever they want to talk to us about. And today we have Makani, who is the Executive Director of the Praxis project based in DC and Oakland, California. And I am proud to say that Makani has been my friend and colleague since 1990, even though neither of us are really that old. So, and I asked Makani to come and talk to us about things that were occupying her mind these days that touch our work on media advocacy and framing and all the work we do at the local level to try to help groups create healthier communities. And I invited Makani because she's one of the smartest thinkers about some of the hardest problems that I think we face together trying to figure out collectively. So I'm going to stop now, let Makani start talking, and then we'll have a conversation with her.
Wow, there we go. You can sit there. You just don't want to be on the screen.
No.
You're actually very photogenic. Unlike myself. No, I'm not going to do that. So one, I have to say how fun it is to be here, that Lori and by extension BMSG is really family to me, and I feel like there's a small number of organizations that I feel very close to, and BMSG is certainly one of them, so it's great to be here. So yay! So it has been interesting thinking about what I want to talk about, and later this week I'm going to participate in a webinar that talks about what funders should be thinking about with regard to racial justice. So this feels like the week to think about, well, what does Makani think about X this week? So let me tell you, or share with you a few ideas, and then I'd love for this to be a conversation, if that works. So the thing that wakes me up in the middle of the night about strategic communications is that I believe too much of it is focused on the idea that communications is simply about what we say to each other, either by news or in conversation at the moment. And that there's not a lot of information or attention to strategic communications as a part of how institutions interact. And so we have all of this work that talks about cognitive framing and cognitive mapping, but now there's all of this thinking about implicit bias, and I want to talk a little more about that in a minute. And the idea is that there is something we can do as communicators that will help rewire our brains and help us think very differently about the issues that we care about. And that this fascination with biology as belief, almost, right, has in many ways, I think, made invisible how propaganda really works, and how much propaganda is about power, as opposed to like smart people who pull levers in some place, and whoever's super smart gets to pull the right lever, and that somehow changes your mind. It also assumes, I think, the idea that what we believe is based on our best thinking. You know, that somehow we're such reasonable human beings that with good information and the right sort of prompts, we're going to think differently about whatever it is. And in fact, it's a multi-million-dollar industry in social justice that unfortunately is displacing organizing, it's displacing even research that helps support the work, it's displacing policy, and even legal advocacy, which are really important tools for how we make change. And not that I believe in zero sum, I think there should be more money for everything. But I just want to focus a little bit on this idea of this sort of biology as belief in some of the larger larger systems which I think are at play. So, you don't like the water in my hand? I was gonna do the what's his name in Pacific, but without judgment. Without judgment. So let's start with what I think are sort of interconnecting beliefs that that we tend to ignore in strategic communications. And this is the part where I get up and write. And so these are all straightforward and things that I'm sure you already know. So one is the idea that, am I doing this right? Yes. Oh, I might have done an extra something there. One is the understanding that as human beings we're all connected, right? And that those people who are the right wing or conservatives or whatever you call them, they try to discourage people from thinking that, right? They don't want you to see other people as human beings. You know how that works, right? And this is not only about humanity, but this is also about the environment, because the other big struggle in the work we do is this idea of who has dominion, right? Do human beings have dominion over the rest of the species and the environment, or are we interconnected? Are our destinies tied? So are our destinies tied as human beings? Are our destinies tied as part of the environment? Those are two big ideas, and actually the same idea, right? That have been contested for centuries, and part of what drives pollution and immigration policy and just you name it. It has a lot to do with where we fall and this idea of how we're connected. The other, and these are all related, that's why it's a Venn diagram kind of sort of, right? Is our understanding of history, or another way of saying this is how we got here. Now, part of the challenge of our work as progressives is to always try to explain context. It's so hard, right? Because it's boring a lot of times. It's not soundbite ready for the most part. And because we have a public school system, and not even just public schools, because private schools can actually kind of suck too. I mean, to be honest, I paid $27,000 a year to send my child to a friend's school. Brilliant, great school, very progressive. And this is an example of this sort of how we got here, right? Freshman year, 9th grade, she had a class on world civilizations. Right? It's a whole year class. So you had one semester that was U.S. history. You had, and okay. That doesn't seem to relate to the land masses the world is put together, but okay. The next semester, she had 8 weeks of European history in various forms. Then about 2 weeks of Asia, and a week of Africa. And you think, wow, that's interesting. And then you think about what's the future of the world, and who lives here, and how do you understand yourself in the context of the globe. And this is a friend's school that people pay a lot of money to send their kids to, and who some of the most important lawyers and doctors and folks in the DC area, and even some folks who were in the White House went there. Right? So you think, if that's a school that does not get that, then what gets that? So that's a big part of this. We have our understanding of interconnectedness, our understanding of history, how we got here, and that's also related to geography and our understanding of where we are in the world, right? And then the other piece is what we think about justice, or what we do about it, right? So for some people, justice, as you know, is everybody goes for what they know, and whoever ends up surviving, it's sort of like life and the world and politics as survivor. Right? And in many ways, there's a relationship between the sort of a rise and importance of those television shows. There's, whether and even cooking shows. Like, it's not even just being on an island, 10 people doing it out, but people are like fighting over creme brulee, and that's right? And that those cultural forms are no accident, right? It's like religions come out of particular kinds of political context, right? Why people became Protestant at the time they became Protestant, how the Protestant religion evolved came out of how work relationships shifted from the sort of peasant, formation and feudalism to sort of more the rise of the bourgeoisie, which it didn't make sense to have a Catholic Church operate in the same way. So you have this other form of Christianity that was really about how workers sort of needed to interact and not have popes and have this sort of decentralization, right? So all of our cultural forms come out of, in some relation, I should say, how we think about money, how we think about each other, what's relevant, right? And so why would communications not be the same? Why would somehow strategic communications be the only thing, right, that somehow gets to miss that and gets to not be engaged in that? So our understanding of these forces and how they come together in many ways is shaped by the work we do and who we choose to be and how we describe our own politics, right? But yet, we hardly ever talk about these things or have strategies that talk about these things in any kind of intentional way in terms of how we're trying to move our strategy or how we want to think about our messaging or that. Sometimes we do, but not very often, because we're told that, that we can't really talk about that. We need to figure out how to do this really small micro-bridge message. And immigration is a great example, right? I know that people think those undocumented facts ads are so smart. I know they want those things, right? They make you look, they got like the commodified label of the human being sitting there looking like, it's almost like what's in their stomach or torso, right? And you like walk by the ads and you're like, I'm deeply disturbed by them, but maybe I'm the only one. It's like a weekend, I'm looking forward to us talking about them, right? And you think, you have anchor babies, right? This idea that people are trying to drop babies as anchors so they can be connected to a place for the money. And then we progressives have, our counter discussion is about, well, actually, we don't take money, we make money. And you just sort of sit with that for a minute and think, well, what does that do, right? What does that say? And how many hundreds of years have we been negotiating and navigating a meta-frame around particularly people of color as needing to be profitable from slavery on? That what is it? Who has to earn their keep in this country? Who doesn't? And how is that raised? And how deeply embedded is that story? And then at what point do you decide that, okay, whether it's immigration, whether it's public school education and the vocationalization of education in the inner city and other communities of color, the idea that you can't just go to school and learn, but you have to be trained to do something useful because that's what colored bodies are for. And that is a direct lineage of the slavery argument. But without our understanding of this, we don't understand. It's just out there floating. But the fact of the matter is that most of the folks who work in opposition to us actually do understand those triggers. And I don't know how many people are following the Texas school book fight, but it's fascinating, right? And you think, well, why would you want to do that? Why would you want to have textbooks that don't mention slavery or call it a trade? Why would you do that? Why would that be important to erase it? And what else do you interrupt So that's another conversation we can have in a minute. And then what does that say about what we do about the problem? Because if there's no history and there's no damage, and we're really not connected anyway, that's pretty much how most of the right-wing arguments go, those three things. Right? And then, and this is the part you're not going to see, I put this up so I can remember. And many of you are already familiar with this triangle, with the pink stuff, maybe not so much the brown writing, but definitely the pink stuff, I'm sure, because I'm sure you've read what I've written. So, what does it mean to change and interrupt this conversation? Right? And to me, this is another way of saying how polling is okay, but it's really not all that. Like all the money people spend on polling, and that it's good, but it doesn't get to what reframing really is about. So, most of our work in strategic communications is up here at the top of the iceberg or the pyramid. Sometimes it gets lower. We're focused on issues. We do polling on the issues. We're not really looking at some of the trigger or relational ideas that help people sort of form their opinions about a particular issue. And one classic example was, I won't name the group. I'll be nice, I won't name the group. But there was about 3 years ago a set of research done on human rights framing. And I was actually appalled because this human rights work that they did and attempt to sort of gather the information didn't look at any of the polling data, which is annual. Gallup does that, and I think there's some other folks that asked folks questions about, well, do you think the U.S. should be on top, or do you think the U.S. is in relationship to other countries? You know, like things that actually are very relevant and seem very clear and concretely related to how you feel about human rights. Never integrated into their analysis. How do people understand geography? Never integrated into their analysis, even though there's surveys every year about what fifth graders know or don't know about what's right. And I know you guys have heard me tell my favorite story about the Texas bilingual education fight in the 90s, where one woman actually did say that if English was good enough for Jesus, for her. So we have a crisis. So we're asked, so we step into this work trying to frame these issues, fighting over facts, most of which are made up, and then we're frustrated because the right they just make shit up. We're like, what happened? What we were trying to argue, and then now, and these things become consolidated as facts in textbooks, because if that textbook goes, and they're the biggest textbook buyers in the country, then there's going to be lots and lots and lots of kids who will read that as fact. Right? And how many folks really question their textbooks when they get it? You know, and there's not even really many hippie moms left to do that for you. They used to do it for us when many of us were growing up. And then sometimes we get as far down as understanding more of the context, right? What are the contemporary tensions? What's the money? What are the issues? How does this work? But here's where I want to stick for a second in terms of what it means to reframe. And so, so we have these mega historical patterns and beliefs, and we have these power relations. Some of it is encoded in law, and some of it is about institutional relationships that are not written down, right? So they're like, who goes to school, what do you learn, what happens in church, why Glenn Beck says, if you hear social justice in church, walk out. Because Christianity and social justice don't go together. Now, there are other people who've been arguing that for a while, but, it's sort of fascinating. I think Jesus might have argued with him quite vociferously on that. But I wasn't there. I just know what they wrote about him. So when we think about reframing, and we're not talking about what happens in schools, what happens in church, And did I destroy
We
that?
lost you.
Sorry. Ah,
There you go.
there we go. So, let's see.
We want to hear the reframing.
When we think about reframing, here we go. To have a comprehensive strategy, we have to pay as much attention to Sunday school curriculum, K through 12 curriculum. What happens in the sort of procedural breakdown of how people are trained, for example, to interact with clients in welfare. These are all places where communications happens at a mass level, where folks learn and understand about the world and the world that they're in, that we pay no attention to as communications folks. We have no vision, for the most part, or no grand strategy for what a 12th grader should believe or know by the time they get out of school. We have no sense of the relationship of what it means to sort of contest with the right what it means to be people of faith, and what does that require of you as in terms of human dignity or human or interconnectedness or stewardship of the environment. And even though that work happens on the ground, and we want to magnify and amplify that organizing, but as communicators, we're not really thinking about how our work can help support folks engaged in it. And relatedly, and probably the part that's the hardest, is we don't have a grand strategy around how to get the vast majority of people to understand that they are connected in a way that they can trust and lean on and not feel like it's some kind of pipe dream. Like it's like you're crazy. It's like it's true, but those other people are jacked up, or whatever the story is. Last thing I'll say, and then I want to open it up, is that as part of my thinking about this, I've been spending a lot of time watching public service announcements and listening to music and other forms of cultural communications of the 60s, which was a period of time when people decided to take this on as a social project. And it's very interesting, and some of you are old enough to remember some of this, most of you are not. Maybe it comes on VH1 sometimes, I don't know, but there was like David and Goliath, which was a cartoon series that was put out by the Lutheran Church. There was PSAs about sharing that was put out by the Presbyterian Church. And they had a little song that it was like, it's fun to share, right? And we have this little ditty that was an effort to try to get people to think differently about stewardship. There was the Crying Indian, right, which most people remember, which is iconic. There was Free to Be You and Me. There was a set of folks, some on the margins, some in the mainstream, who decided that they wanted to leverage culture as a way to have a conversation about our values as a country. Some about gender, some about race, some about all kinds of things. And the more I get steeped in watching it, in fact, it's a little disorienting, so I'll spend like 4 hours watching it, and I'm like, oh man, I want to be back there. I don't want to be. It's like, and then I'm watching the conversation on Syria, I'm like, oh, if I could go back there, kind of. I want to go to a forward place that's as cool, but 2.0. But it is interesting to me to see what is possible. And also to watch the right's conversation to try to reframe the 60s as sort of drug smoking, excessive, nothing substantive, nothing useful, as a way to interrupt what might be a natural place for folks to go back to take a look at, to explore. And not that they're completely successful, because clearly folks who are younger are looking to that era and understanding more about that era on their own terms. But to me, it'd be interesting to imagine, what would it look like to have this grander strategy, to understand propaganda for what it is, because propaganda is actually, it's a good thing. It's about using communication and culture to help people move and act in particular kinds of ways. You know? And it can be used for good and evil. It's not like it's exclusively evil or exclusively good. So let's stop. Because I know you guys are smart and you have all kinds of things to say about it, so I'm going to go to you have to say.
Well, I can't help but think about Lakoff.
Yeah?
And
Not Gramsci? Like, okay.
George. And I'm just curious if there's some consistency in this idea of the issue being on top, which he talks about, you know, if you really want to get to people, you don't land on the nitty-gritty details, you land on the values. And I'm curious about this sort of, your thoughts on whether that's something that aligns with this idea of sort of digging a little deeper, getting to the context, getting to the history, when we're talking about, bless you, when we're talking about, you know, getting to what's going to resonate with people on a more emotional basis versus the facts and the nitty-gritty.
So, let me say this. Let me say this. I think that when you try to resonate with people emotively, which is great, or try to resonate with people analytically, or both, trying to resonate with people as in a brief sort of communicative interaction is a limited form of framing. It is the most limited form you can engage in. And I feel like in some ways that's where we're stuck. We either say, well, you'll have a soundbite that's like this, or you'll have a soundbite that's like that. And I guess what I'm suggesting is, yes, values are important, but where do they come from? Where are they produced? They're produced by a range of institutional actors interacting with human beings, right? And if we don't get involved in how those institutions produce the values, then we're just up at the surface, and we never fundamentally change anything. We have moments of strategic, or actually not even strategic, moments of soundbite clarity where something takes on, and it's a meme, and it goes, and then it's gone. And you can't even remember it happened. Right? And we can't keep doing that. So yes, let go, values, build a better soundbite, do your thing. We got to do that at some point, but we have to get deeper than that. So I don't feel like they're mutually exclusive, but I'm hoping we can get more focused at a level beyond what we say.
I have a follow-up question to that. So, so everyone's like, I don't know if someone else was already trying to jump on. So this is definitely along the same line of how do we get deeper? Because I think that everyone in this room is definitely on the same page that if it weren't for the historical context, if it weren't for, you know, the policies of the U.S., you know, talking about slavery, talking about our immigration policy, talking about all these things, we wouldn't be where we are today. But when we're in trainings, this is probably the most frequent question I get that's the most difficult, because I think about fair game and some of the writing that I've read that you all have done, Praxis has done, and I try to, it brings up a lot of questions for me, because someone will bring up well, I'm trying to convince these decision makers that a community garden needs to happen. If I, should I use the argument that in the end they'll save money because people will be healthier and they'll be more united if I think they care about that? When in reality, I know that it should happen because it's the just thing to do because of, racist policies that only gave home loans to certain people as opposed to others when they came back from, the war and, zoning laws, et cetera, that, divested from some neighborhoods as opposed to others, and the fact that we had a freeway built here, they could provide that larger context, which is, in a way, it's, who cares? My question, I guess, is, does it matter if we get a community garden if these, the people in power don't really understand that, the reason we're here is because of, or not, if the larger conversation isn't about the context that led us to needing these, extra gardens in some communities as opposed to others. So I guess that's more of a, how do you kind of weigh or negotiate the digging deeper and providing the context with these little wins, these incremental changes that people are fighting for that we work with day in, day out?
So I think it's a both and. So two things. One, I think it's completely fine to, particularly in the case of community garden, right, to say how it helps the economy or how it, that's totally fine. We should do that because, and anything that helps build solidarity economies and green economies, help people understand the benefits of equity, that's great. We should do that. Now, to me, it's a question of strategic GPS. Because when you look at where you want to go, the destination helps you figure out what's in between. I think what happens is a lot of folks don't actually understand where they want to go because they don't spend any time talking about it or thinking about it. And then that means they end up in all kinds of weird places, both message-wise and politically, right? Immigration is a classic example because folks are, and I get it. I come out of family immigrants. I get the importance of a pathway to citizenship. Totally understand it, right? And I've spent time with folks who this is a matter of life and death. They got to figure this out. Totally get that, right? And totally understand compromise, but without a clear sense of, well, at some point we have to get to this place of recognizing borders as political realities, but not actual realities, right? We have to get to a place where, like Exodus, I'm not a super Bible person, but I'm a preacher's kid and a preacher's grandkid. But it's very clear in the Bible that you're supposed to treat foreigners the same as you treat people who are from the same place. It's like so at what point does that happen, right? And I'm really heartened by like projects like the Welcome projects that these churches are doing, where they're like, welcome to Denver, welcome to, it's like another way of thinking about it, like not borders, but welcome, right? So, because if you know where you're going, then you start to think differently about what you ask for. And then I think the other piece is there is an art to how you tell the story, and that in a community there's a story about what happened, what unjust, just, or whatever, and you can tell that story. You can tell that story, and Larry actually, what they're doing in Portland, I think, is really interesting, where they're having folks who were displaced, right, coming back and talking about what used to be there and how that's changing how people think about where they live. You can find ways to leverage the way human beings process information from other human beings, right, to tell different stories. One of the things we do when we do our training, and I'll just say this real quick because I want to make sure we get as many people talking. I did a training with environmental activists who are doing watershed work in what they call Delmar, right, the Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, really DC area, right? And so we started talking about this relationship of stewardship versus dominion, interconnectedness, and helping people understand that there's limited resources, right? That there's these underlying things versus the small technical details, and this gets back to sort of the Lakoff and other folks who talk about the 1, 2, 3 and it's being stuck at 3, right? And what was interesting is when we had this broader conversation about what it meant to shift people from stewardship to interconnectedness, the conversation about what they actually wanted to talk about in the short-term change. So they talked about changing their fact sheets, right, to say more about how people were dependent on the waterways, and there's a sweet spot between that sort of like economic hardcore reality and helping people understand what interconnectedness means, right? So I feel like when we're clear about these larger meta messages, then we can build backwards, and it doesn't feel so crazy.
I got a question. I've got a few things, but the thing I want to ask the most is, to go back to Gramsci, if you will, I have the sense that in addition to all of the work the right is doing to try and control institutions, to try and control the way in which common sense. Well, as you said, they got a lot of money, right? So they got a lot of pockets, a lot of fingers, but in a lot of other ways, the more fundamental disruption of capitalism eating itself right now, right, I think is also opening up opportunities for common sense to be disrupted. People are engaged in long-term unemployment, right? Young people right now are entering an incredibly uncertain future of employment, right? I mean, the stats about the number of 20-somethings living at home, facing certainly a reality in America that hasn't been present for a long time, for a much broader swath, at least of the white middle class, than it has for quite a few decades. And at the same time, it seems like, I don't know as many young people as I'd like to, that there is also a deeper sense of disengagement with political institutions that there's been in a long time. And so I'm just wondering, like, what you think that means for trying to organize and especially to, what you're talking about, like trying to connect communications with organizing. So it seems like some of the most effective is through really innovative demands making, which kind of is what you're saying in your last question. So I'm thinking about the movement for justice in the fast food industry asking for $15 an hour, right? Which on face is probably not going to happen or very difficult to achieve, right? Which makes it a great thing to go for, right? Because it organizes. This is what it would take. This is what we need to survive. Otherwise, we're living in poverty and working full time.
So, sound like you answered your own question, but I'll just add to your what I thought was really smart thought. So, I think that one, there's incredible organizing going on. People are super smart, for folks who got to hang out at Roots and Remedies, you see just a small part of that. And not only is there smart organizing going on locally, but the tendency is more and more folks are coming together in different kinds of formations nationally. And there's a bottom-up work and analysis that I think is incredible and important. And I'm very heartened. I think that, and it's true that the pain of the economy is broader and broader. And unlike the Depression, though, we don't have a common story. We don't have a shared understanding of what's happening. And depending on where you are on the political spectrum, even if you are suffering, your story might be that government is picking your pockets, and that's why you don't have a job. And in many ways, what the right is pushing for is to try to bolster capitalism with public monies. So that the reason why the cuts are happening in the social service sector is essentially to provide new opportunities for capital for the private sector. And so, you saw it more blatantly with the bailout, the Wall Street bailout, but that stuff is going on in agriculture all over the place. this is how capitalism is essentially running on public dollars, right? It's pretty serious, and it's an untold story. It's a story that most people haven't really grasped. They don't really understand it, and the very same people who were saying government sucks, we hate government, are the ones who are pushing for these dollars, and they fund themselves that way too. I mean, I thought Ted Stevens out of Alaska was a classic example in terms of how that works. And that the public sector is a huge engine in the economies of most states. There's some states like New Mexico, it's almost 1 out of 3 jobs. So, and that's something people aren't even dealing with. And what's interesting, and this is sort of a place for race into what's in everything, but because in so many of these places, because of the relative fairness and openness of the hiring process, there tends to be more people of color in public sector jobs than whites, right? And so then they have become the new welfare, right? So it's sort of like so what's happening in the South, and particularly about trying to take out the public sector, is really about the ability to do that because the face of government jobs, particularly in the South, and in many cases in the Northeast, are women of color. And they're the ones most affected by these cuts. Right? And even in places like Wisconsin, there's even though you saw one face in terms of what was on television, but there was even in a place like Wisconsin, which is not that many people of color, there's a higher proportion of women of color who are affected by this cut. So we have this this mass dislocation. I was in Milwaukee up until Saturday. 57% unemployment for black men. Wow. Right? And you can see it. 21 homicides this summer. Right? Chicago is similarly situated. So, and it's all over the country. So you think, how do we build the sense of solidarity where people sort of, again, interconnectedness, see that it's the same story, that your 22-year-old son who's still living in your basement, can't get a job out of college after you spent $150,000 in tuition, is like part of the same problem that has kids in Chicago shooting each other, right? And how do we help build that story? Part of it is, again, and it goes back to how do you understand, what's your understanding of the history patterns? Most people don't know anything about the economy. You can get a PhD in almost anything but economics, actually in economics, and still not know about the economy, right, and how it works. It's almost hidden language, right? It's a hidden knowledge. People have bank accounts, don't know how banks work. There's just, and where do you learn that? And can you imagine how different the conversation would be if, in order to graduate from high school, you had to understand how the economy worked? Not just how to balance your checkbook and do the math, but how does the economy work? Just the basics. Right? Most people don't know. Most of us don't know. So how can you even be in the conversation? So, and to me, that's what I mean about sort of the fundamental framing. So imagine if curriculum or curricula around the country help people make that shift. Imagine if they understood geography. Imagine if they were able to have a substantive conversation on alternatives. Because right now, folks think that democracy and capitalism are synonyms. I mean, they do. And then look what happened to Occupy. I mean, Occupy was a moment, and this again shows you what happens when you're not dealing beyond the surface. Occupy, brilliant, great stuff. All the right poster people, white kids, who people can relate to, and articulate, most of them college educated, and and I hung out in Occupies all over the country, met people. It was basically sort of bubbly white college kids and people of color who were homeless and many who had mental health problems. It was like not completely, but it was a lot of that, right? Which was fascinating, right? And that's a whole nother talk. We don't even have time for that. But Occupy was a movement that talked about capitalism straight up, unadulterated conversation. Movie stars were hanging out, people were loving it. Where are they now? Where is that conversation now? Right? Don't even know. And it's not that people don't feel in their hearts and in their minds that something's wrong. It's not that they haven't figured out someplace that it's systemic. But the countervailing factors that attacked that movement piece by piece, taking them apart on every level, the lack of diversity, and a lot of the folks who are talking about the lack of diversity were not progressive people. Don't get it twisted.
Right.
They were not even progressive people, right? Because most progressive people, even leaders in communities of color, is like, yeah, it's not a lot of people of color, but hey, right on. So, that's, I ain't sleeping down there, right? And so I don't think we even understand how smart the opposition was to that. It was so smart it looked like it's self-destructive. When I don't think it did. Yes.
This is a question on a totally different plane. You just heard that I had recently returned to the U.S. After quite a long time. And I've really been struck by the frequency and way I hear the word story being used. That people have common stories, untold stories, that people focus on their stories. When the words I would use would be their history or their testimony or their reality. And in the situations that I am familiar with, those words would carry much more power and they would be much more convincing to talk about my testimony or my history or my experience or my reality. And all of those words get subsumed into this concept of story. I hear it all the time. And I'm just curious if that's some sort of new speak or discourse that has a significance, or why are those other words that to me seem more powerful, why aren't they being used?
I think that's a good question. I want to say I am one of those people who do not like the exclusive focus on narrative as framing. I think that's for all the reasons that I spoke about earlier. I just think it's just it's just simplistic, and narrative and framing are not the same. Narrative is a tool, one tool for framing. I think that context and time. So I know for a particular generation of folks, story sounds like it's not as legitimate or substantive or true. It sounds like, oh, that's your story, right? And so that has a particular kind of I think even generational. And it's interesting because reality is, particularly in this context of gaming, has another whole set of values and understandings and connotations associated with it. So we make words have power based on their context. And so I think it's an interesting thing to figure out, well, what does that mean? People say story, people say narrative, like that's so super great. Who knows? Who knows? And then there's folks who are anti-religious who are afraid of testimony and things that feel like it's taking them off of, or that don't feel grounded in a particular kind of well, let me put it this way, that feel religious. But I think that any word is up for grabs, Orwellian or whatever. You can make a word be whatever it is, with enough energy, time, resources, and people to say it.
So I'm going to take the prerogative of the last question. And I love, by the way, strategic GPS. I'll be stealing that immediately. That's a nice little phrase that is exactly the same as our quote in the lobby of BMSG from Alice in Wonderland. That, you know, the Cheshire Cat, you know, if she doesn't know where she's going, then it hardly matters what her next step is. And so, anyway, I'll be stealing that. So I want to circle back to where you started, because I think this was really interesting. Makani, we constantly struggle with trying to get from the personal to the environmental, as you know. But I hadn't really thought about how the way we've been studying framing itself takes us so deeply inside the body that we're now thinking about neurons and embodied knowledge and all that kind of stuff, which is fine and good and probably true, but unless we can better connect it to the context and the environment and the power at the bottom of the pyramid, we're not going to get very far. And as far as we get, I mean, I think from the perspective of the silos that we are funded to work through, context is the word we use to push out and help people see that, but it's hard for us to get down to power. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, there are other conversations going on about racial justice, and you mentioned implicit bias. And I just, maybe you could just tie those things back together again for us, to get us, help us connect what we know is important about how framing works to make it, what should we be thinking about so that we can tie racial justice and power to within the context of the silos we're working in.
I appreciate that question. Yay. So implicit bias is a great example, right, of how this plays out. So I think most of you know what it is. It's pretty straightforward. It's that embedded in our brains is what we've learned about race and who's great and who's not so great and all of those things. Right? So what's interesting is, so now there's millions of dollars being put into efforts to talk to people about the fact that they have implicit bias. Okay. So what would that look like if we were to think about, well, how is implicit bias actually created? Is it really, and how does it get in our brains in the first place? What happens on television, right? Or in the places where we get imagery. What we read, what we learn in school. You know, how you learn about slavery, when you did learn about slavery, you learn that the Africans were so stupid because they didn't have guns, and the Europeans had guns, and that's how come they're slaves. Not that they were barbaric, messed up people who decided that they didn't want to work and to get some people to work for free. That would be a different frame, right? on how slavery started, right? But somehow that's not in textbooks. But it seems pretty obvious to me. And I think a classic example is, can you imagine a story about the Holocaust where Jews were so stupid that they were interned? Like, that is, it's pretty amazing, right? Can you imagine? That would never happen. You know, and this, but for most people of color, the sort of narrative is that the reason why the things happen to us is because we were like, for the native folks, they were just not sturdy, and they just had disease. I mean, this is weird. You know, like, you read the book and you're like, wow, did I actually read that and passed a test on that in school? Like, what is that? So you think one point of power would be, how do we change what's fact? That's a huge part of the frame, right? We would be engaged in a conversation with, like, American Federation of Teachers and NEA and student organizers and all of these folks, and say, how would we reimagine K through 12 so that people actually learn things that were true about all this? To me, that would be attacking the power issues and power relations in at a very important place. So that would be a fulcrum to me. I think another place is and it's work that folks used to do more of, but we don't do as much of. When we think about imagery, and we think about how folks are portrayed, what stories are told, how do we understand that, and then we think about the current conversation and what people get to say and what they don't get to say. And back in the early 70s, there was a sense of taboo about particular kinds of racist speech. That if you said things, that's where the political correctness came as a counter-argument, which was brilliant, but wrong. They won, but it was still wrong. The idea that that you could say something sexist and you should be able to say something racist and it's okay because they're asking you to be correct, and why would you want to be correct? And you're like, well, actually, correct is not bad, right? Correct is correct. And that was not only an argument around speech, but it was also an argument around accuracy, around arguments. And so it not only took out the ability to have conversations where you could talk to people about racist or sexist or whatever kind of speech, but it also made it so that you didn't have to be accurate in your argument. Mm-hmm. And it completely devalued the voice of the intellectual and the scholar and the expert as researchers. People who knew things about whatever the issue was, they didn't have to be in the conversation anymore. And that was brilliant too, right? Because you had like the bell curve come out and all of the geneticists, just about everyone, because it wasn't written by geneticists, right. It was written by psychologists. Well, one person wasn't even involved in anything close, right? Anything close, but one was a psychologist who had no kind of genetic background at all. And my friend Ramona Edwin organized a press conference at the National Press Club with Nobel Prize winning geneticists to say that the bell curve was bullshit. And it didn't matter. And that's what this does. That's what correctness did. It made it so you can have conversations with experts without it. So I feel like if we can create the space where people who actually know what they're talking about can get to speak, whether that's experiential or academic, I think that's another place where power relations matter. And the last thing I'll say about this is I was having a conversation with Nancy Krieger some years back, and I know you all know who she is, and you're all probably fans because she's like the rock star, right? She's like rock star epidemiologist. Right? I know, exactly.
I've seen you on panels with her.
I love her. Nancy's the bomb, right? And we were having this conversation, and I was saying to Nancy, one of these days, what we have to do is stop thinking about how we speak proof to power. Like somehow it's going to change. And I don't know how many of you guys are Boondocks fans or ever watch the Boondocks. If you ever saw the very first episode where Huey has this dream that he walks through the garden party and he says stuff and people's heads explode. And then when he actually says it, everyone says, oh, how cute, you're so well spoken, right? And that's kind of how we are in some ways, is that we haven't figured out how to make what we say matter because of the power issues. And I feel like part of what we need to do is do the old school scope power analysis, look at who gets to matter in particular conversations, look at where they are, look at what perch they're sitting in, what television shows are they on, where's MSNBC, where's Rachel Maddow, and what do we do as a strategic sort of initiative to become more powerful in the conversation, because we think about powerful messaging, but we don't think about the work of, well, how do you get to be here with the mic, and how does what you say have more influence than what Glenn Beck or whoever. And I thought that why am I drawing a blank on them all of a sudden? I can't believe it. Rashad Robinson, and the name of the organization is, oh gosh, they were like the black spin-off of
Color of Change.
Color of Change, yes. The Color of Change did to make Glenn Beck less important. Right? So I feel like we need to do some of that, and then we need to figure out how to make some of our folks more important without it becoming sort of demagoguery and weird. But I would love to see Nancy Krieger be the go-to person on MSNBC for health analysis. Like, why not, right? Like, or whoever. You know, there's all kinds of folk that we need to have a strategy around it. So that's where I think about power. Done.
Problem solved.
Yeah. Thank you, Makani, and I think lots to think about as always. And thank you. And we might just have to have you back again.